You walk through the story of Africa today as though it began at independence, as though the lines on the map were always there. Yet, if you stretch your mind just a little further back, past the flags and anthems, you see a different picture forming. One where a continent rich in languages, identities, trade systems, and deeply rooted cultures was carved up in rooms far away from its shores. During gatherings like the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, where strangers, men who had never set foot in many of these lands, drew borders with rulers and ink, slicing through ethnic groups, merging rivals into single political units and separating families who had shared history for centuries, all in pursuit of control, access, and extraction. And you start to realize that what you call countries today were never designed with you in mind. They were engineered for administrative ease and economic gain. A system that made it easier to identify where resources lay and how best to move them outward. If you have the stomach for it, you must admit that these strangers did not act alone, because history shows that some of our own people stood beside them, guided them, negotiated with them, and sometimes benefited from the arrangements. Meaning that the story of exploitation is not a simple tale of outsiders versus insiders, but a reality where collaboration, coercion, survival, and betrayal were all entangled, leaving behind a legacy that still breathes in your present day. Even the infrastructure that is often celebrated as development tells a story that demands honesty, because those early railway lines stretching across a lot of terrains were laid down with a clear direction in mind, moving from the interior, where minerals like cocoa, palm oil, and other resources were abundant, moving those straight to the ports along the coasts, creating efficient corridors for export rather than networks that connected African communities to each other, right? So while it may appear as though development was gifted to Africans, the intention beneath it reveals a structure built to serve industries elsewhere, feeding factories in Europe while leaving fragmented economies behind. You must question how much of what you inherited was ever designed for your own growth versus how much was designed for someone else's convenience. Let's bring it forward to today, and the fractures begin to make painful sense. Because when people who were never meant to function as a single political unit are forced into one, tensions simmer beneath the surface, waiting for triggers, and those triggers often come as politics, religion, or ethnicity. Yet beneath all that noise lies something really ugly. A system that rewards division, a system that thrives when you distrust your neighbor, when you see difference as a threat, when you forget the shared history of disruption that brought you both here in the first place. Okay? And so you watch South Africans turn against Nigerians. You see tensions flare between Ghanaians and others across the continent. You witness the scars within Nigeria itself, where insurgencies like Boko Haram continue to take lives and spill into neighboring countries. And then if you decide to widen your lens, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because this is not isolated to a few places. It stretches across the continent in ways that should force you to pause and ask harder questions. Somalia is still trapped in a civil war that has stretched for decades. Ethiopia, carrying the wounds of the Tigray conflict, where entire communities have been devastated. Sudan and South Sudan, caught in cycles of civil war and tribal clashes over land, cattle, and power. The Democratic Republic of Congo, enduring relentless violence from armed groups fighting over mineral-rich territories. The Sahel region, spanning from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, burning under insurgencies that thrive where governance is weak and inequality is deep. Let's talk about Mozambique, battling insurgency in Cabo Delgado. Cameroon facing an Anglophone crisis alongside extremist violence. In Libya, being fractured by rival governments and militias. Western Sahara locked in a long-standing territorial dispute and across at least 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Active conflicts continue to shape daily life for millions. And when you trace these conflicts carefully, you will notice a rhythm, a pattern, where identity, power, and resources intersect in ways that keep reopening wounds that were never geared toward healing. Conflict and resource discovery seem to move together like brothers. Where oil in the Niger Delta fuels unrest, where minerals in Congo attract endless fighting, where land and water scarcity ignites violence in Sudan. And you ask yourself, if you allow yourself to have common sense, whether this is a coincidence or something far more deliberate, whether instability has become a condition that benefits certain interests, both outside and within. Because again, you must confront the truth that the continuation of these fractures cannot be sustained by outsiders alone. It requires internal actors, local power structures, and systems that keep rewarding division over unity. This is where you really listen, because it is no longer enough to carry pride, I'm an African, without understanding the weight of what that identity has endured. It is no longer enough to argue over surface level differences while deeper structures remain untouched. Ashishan Wellness and Consultancy. What is being asked of you is simple in words, right? You can say anything, but it is demanding in practice to ask better questions, to look beyond what is presented, to trace the roots of conflict instead of reacting to its symptoms, to examine who benefits from division, who profits from chaos, who gains when you stay distracted by each other, because when you begin to ask those questions with honesty and courage, something shifts. Your awareness sharpens. Your anger finds positive direction, and your identity starts to rebuild itself on truth rather than fragments. And maybe, just maybe, right? That is where a different kind of Africa will emerge. One shaped by people who remember, who question, and who refuse to keep playing a game that was never designed for us to win